Well, hello, pilgrims. I'm Bruce McDonald, and this is the Telemanker Review. Brandon's a little stuffed up, so he'll come on later in the week. Well, it's very nice to have my son here. Those of you who are parents know that feeling. You know, when you have a child or children, and you experience the life with your child, you raise your child, you see your child into adulthood, all these sorts of things. My wife loves children. She only had one. I think under different circumstances, she would have had a dozen kids. It's such a simple life. Family. So simple, so straightforward. Incidentally spiritual. Having a family is a spiritual path, if you're devoted to the family. In many ways, that was really the spiritual building block of all social reality, was the family. I can't even imagine what it's like to be my age, 58, and not have kids. And, you know, I was talking about this with a friend off air, and something happened in the 20th century which had I'm not going to say it never happened before, but in the 20th century, a number of different life expressions crept up. Before the 20th century, there were just a handful of things you could do. You could be a tradesman of some sort, be a farmer, and in both instances, you'd probably have a family. Be a soldier. There's been work for soldiers for centuries, for millennia. There's always been work for soldiers. You could be an artist of some sort. I mean, Shakespeare was performed 500 years ago. So they had actors, they had theater, the Greeks had actors, the Greeks had theater. But people were defined by the roles they chose to play in life. And those roles were relatively limited. And then a term crept into our language. And I'm going to actually look this up now and find out where it came from, because I'm curious. And the term is role model. I nailed it. This is what I mean by razor sharp intuition. The earliest known use of the noun role model is in the 1940s. The Oxford English Dictionary's earliest evidence for role model is from 1944 in American Sociological Review. Role model is formed within English by compounding the etymons role, which is a noun, and and model, which is a noun. Let's just check the Oxford English Dictionary here. That was just the first one that popped up on Google. Stay with me. This is going to pay. I know what I'm doing. So they made a noun. They want me to get a subscription to look at the definition. Forget it. All right, so role model. Role models have been one of the main ways that they've affected social change. Okay? And before that, there were no role models. All figures of reverence prior to a few centuries ago were religious. All objects of veneration were religious. All humans of veneration came from a religious or spiritual role. And I would say that this was universal. Certainly true in the West, certainly true in Europe, certainly true. I guess you could say that new figures emerged with the colonization of Australia, New Zealand, and Canada and the United States. You know, pioneer was a role model of a type, you know. And remember, when we all came over to North America, we were pioneers. We were not immigrants. You know, an immigrant is somebody who lands and meets people and has a bunch of arrangements made for them and then wait for a paperwork process to finalize so they gain citizenship. I know when my family came over to Canada, the MacDonald family in, I think, 1798 is when we came over. Came over on a wooden boat, and a significant percentage, I think somewhere between 10 or 20% of the people would die in transport. Let me just check that. I like to check things when I'm talking to you, folks. How many people would typically die in a voyage from England to the United States 300 years ago? Morbidity and mortality on the North Atlantic Passage. The voyage from Europe to America in the 18th century has been, which would be the 1700s, has been portrayed as a harrowing experience. The historical literature has been full of examples of traumatic crossings where starvation, thirst, sickness from a host of diseases, cramped quarters, heat, cold, dampness, contrary winds, raging seas, unpalatable food, and the foul water led to much suffering and death. German migrants apparently suffered the worst of these conditions. In some cases, the causes of this misery were attributed to the cruelty or indifference of ship owners and their captains. Overall, European voyage mortality has been considered comparable to what prevailed in the slave trade. However, little quantitative evidence has been offered of mortality on representative North Atlantic voyages to support this view. In the case of Anyways, I heard some time ago it was like 30%, like almost like 1 in 3 people would die coming over. So that was not an immigrant experience. All due respect to the people crossing from, that passage from, Africa to Greece. It's maybe 60 kilometers of ocean. You know, is it fun? No. It doesn't compare to a 3 or 4 week continental voyage on a wooden sailboat on which all your food would have to be stored as well. So you'd be traveling either with salted meat or livestock that would be slaughtered and butchered right on the ship. Sacks of grain. Undoubtedly, there would be vermin on the boats. It would be impossible to keep rats off. Anywhere there's food, there's rats. Anyways, why am I going on and on and on about this? So the Pioneer, let me rebase, okay? So the idea of the role model was created to destabilize the natural structures that keep human beings whole, like family. Okay? So when you go back and you look at all the programming in the 70s, second wave of feminism, right? So the suffrage movement gets them the vote. What's the first thing that women did when they got the vote in the United States? Anybody? Bueller? They became a voting bloc and a voting power, and they brought in prohibition. So the first public act of women in the electoral process in the United States was to castigate their men. Now, I don't know how bad drunkenness was. I mean, how could it be any worse than cocaine, heroin, fentanyl, crystal meth, tent cities in LA? But that was the first thing women did with the vote in the United States, was the suffrage movement. And that is a very interesting observation. I had several women. Several. When I say several, it's like usually 3. I can't remember. Two I know for sure, and the third I heard secondhand. But I had I cover this in in the first 3 chapters of The Devil in Us, talking about myself growing up through this period in the 70s and the turmoil it created between my very traditional father, who wanted his wife to stay home with the kids because he made enough money to support the family, and he felt that a woman should be with the kids until they're the youngest is at least 13. And this was a monumental battle. It's documented in The Devil in Us, a memoir of you and me. And but if you go back and you look at the TV of that time, what is it? It's all these independent women role models. Okay? So let's just take a look. And if it's not that, it's taking apart existing models of consciousness, like All in the Family, Archie Bunker. This is what we need to make fun of. But we don't bully. We don't bully because we're leftists. We don't bully. This isn't bullying. This is social correction through humor. Right? Sitcoms in the 70s. Three's Company. Mary Tyler Moore's there. Happy Days, of course, for those of you. Taxi. Everybody remembers Taxi. That was a great show. All in the Family. Good Times, Rhoda, which I think was a Mary Tyler Moore spinoff. WKRP in Cincinnati, they had a few female role models in that. Mork and Mindy. Alice. Remember Alice, the waitress, the tough as nails, single mom? Right? So celebrating the single mother, that became a role model. What kind of a society would celebrate a single mother? Now, I know many of you who listen to me are probably single mothers. By many, I don't mean a majority, but 10, 15, 20, 25%. I can assure you that no child wants to be raised by a single mother. No child wants to be raised by a single father either. It's not about gender. The family is the cohesive unit. It is the solar system for the developing psyche of children. You've got the sun and the moon, the father and the mother. And any deviation from that is a deliberate corruption of one of the most fundamental building blocks of human existence. But this role model went deeper than that. Okay? And a lot of it, I have to be honest about this, a lot of this role model, the rugged, solitary, rootless, family, without family, world-weary, wandering, wise person, was very often, in the early 20th century, a writer or a poet. Now, many of them did marry and have children. Wallace Stevens, by the way, that's a bona fide Mandela effect. I have not been able to stop thinking about that since I accidentally discovered it live on air. A couple people reached out to me. One of them studied literature at university. He said, no, Bruce, you're 100% right. Wallace Stevens got the Nobel Prize in 1955. So not even time is sacrosanct anymore. Okay? Not even time. What amazes me most about these role models is, now sometimes they're useful. Sometimes the person is actually more productive and contributes more to the human race as a solitary figure, abandoning family, than if they were to go the traditional family route. I would say that someone like Dr. Jack Cruz is an example. He's the guy that got me banned, I think, the last time. But he's definitely an example, you know, puts his whole heart into life, loves humanity. So the key is the coupling with love. The key is coupling with love. So I held on to life through spiritual love, through spiritual practice, and through the cultivation of an art form that allowed me to communicate with people. And then from there, I segued into the more, for me, the much more difficult personal love, which is always difficult for somebody raised in extreme trauma. Love is very, very difficult because all the trust goes away. You just don't trust people anymore. You become like that 14-year-old foster kid on his 19th home. You just can't trust people. Why would you trust people? Couple of the more ridiculous role models I've seen in the last half dozen decades or so, and some of you might not like this. Oh, I didn't finish my thought about the beginning of The Devil and Us. These three women, they stopped reading the book at that point because there was just one line. I said my mom was not. I didn't take sides. I just, from the perspective of an 8-year-old child, I explained what I saw in the house. My mom was a product of the 70s. She read Cosmopolitan magazine. She watched Mary Tyler Moore, and she wanted to go out and Mary Tyler Moore the world. She didn't want to stay home with kids. And to my father, that was insulting and deeply, deeply hurtful. Now, you can call my father a caveman if you want. I mean, the truth, for reasons I have yet to disclose on air, he was absolutely a caveman. You know, but I think in this one respect, he was actually right, that this was the better way to do things. And it's not like my mom. Now, my mom did have a degree. She had a nursing degree, you know, but my dad made like really good money. My dad was making over $100K a year in the 80s. Right? Like he's making like $100K a year in like 1985. Over $100K a year. You know, that would be like, I don't know, like 300-400 grand now. Right? Some almost 40 years later. Or 30 years later. No, 15 and 24 is 29. Now 39, almost 40 years earlier. God, it's sometimes hard to reconcile how old I am now. When I sit down to do the math, in my mind, I'm always 28. I don't know what it is. I don't know if any of you are like that as well, but like, I'm always, 28 years old in my mind. I don't know why that is, but it just is the way it is. Anyways, so the two most ridiculous role models of the 20th century were Diane Fossey and Jane Goodall. Absolutely, completely, and utterly wasted lives, as far as I'm concerned. Now, they've been almost canonized now. Now, if you don't know who they are, Diane Fossey was the woman who left everything, went to Africa, literally lived with silverback gorillas for decades, published on them in nature journals. I forget what her scientific background was. But she literally lived in the jungle with silverback gorillas, and everybody thought, wow, women can do anything. And I'm looking at this and I'm going, who the fuck would want to do that? And what did they learn? What important research? And then Jane Goodall spent all her time with chimps. Same thing in Africa. Diane Fossey was murdered by poachers for trying to protect gorillas. You can't make this shit up. Like, I think morally she was right, but I mean, dying. So she never had kids. She never got married, and she died defending a primate family she made up in her head. Tell me that isn't the most fucked up thing you've ever heard in your life. Okay? And we revere this woman. Same thing with Jane Goodall. Every time I see that woman, like, she's a sweet woman and everything. I'd probably really enjoy having a tea with her. And I get it. I get it. Believe me, I get it more than you. I live in the rainforest. I understand the wanting to be in nature and everything. But nothing really significant came out of their research. And yet these women were constantly celebrated. Gloria Steinem was another very, very powerful voice in second wave feminism. Okay? And then second wave feminism became this really sort of dark and draconian nonsense, right? Almost like you weren't a real feminist unless you were a lesbian or something, right? It went from championing women to hating men. And that is your first clue that the entire model of their movement is off base. You know, another person making the rounds a lot lately after Trump's election is a Canadian writer by the name of Margaret Atwood. Some of you may know her. She's probably I've met her. Don't care for her. Very toxic vibe. I felt like I was standing beside a witch when I was standing beside her at a book launch party in Toronto in like 2008. She's 80 now, 79 or 80, so I probably met her when she was, I don't know, in her mid-60s or something. But just like a horrible, not a good person. And then she's out there acting like an intellectual, like she's got some insight. Okay? Now, I know it takes a lot of courage to go into the public square and, you know, speak your mind, speak from your heart. I respect that. I do. You know, kind of like that Jerry Maguire moment where he prints off his memorandum at the sports agency and distributes it to all his colleagues and gets fired. They think he's nuts. We need to care more about the players. No, we're here to make money. Anyways. Yeah, so Atwood's out there and she's going on and on about reproductive rights and women should have control over their bodies. I mean, first of all, that's not an intellectually cogent position, nor is it egalitarian. It's a manifestation. So I'm going to say some things tonight, and some of you might hate me. Okay? And I remain free to change my mind in the future. Okay? So, but this is just on my mind. I think one of the most evil things that's been done to us is tampering with gender roles. And transgenderism is just the final expression of it. It's just for the morons who weren't able to pick up on what was going on in the 70s, which my father, he knew. This is bullshit. He's a very smart, very perceptive guy in his own way. His only defect was the guy had demons, like literally had demons. And was not possessed, but he could become possessed. Okay? And he had, like, demons. I mean, literally. That's really what the devil in us was about, coming to grips with the generational demons in my family. And you can do it yourself. You don't need Jesus to save you. You can do it yourself. It's hard, but there's more value and self-respect in doing it yourself. Yeah. So I think, you know, when I think about like people like Gloria Steinem, who was a CIA asset. So feminism was a CIA agenda. And by the way, like, I'm not giving you my opinions. Sometimes on the Talamanca review, I'll give you my opinion. But in the rare instances that I give you my opinion, I'll say this is my opinion. What I'm telling you today are facts. They're facts. Okay? You know, I go back to the Hollywood producer, Aaron Russo. Most famous for producing a hit movie in the early 70s, The Rose, with Bette Midler. And sometimes these outsiders, if they gain enough notoriety, they'll start to interact with this controller class. You know, the kinds of people who have 9-year-olds like Annika Lucas available for world leaders and bankers and stuff like that. The kinds of people who have a stable of 9-year-old mind-controlled satanic slaves to sexually pleasure and blackmail powerful people. Those kinds of people. And Russo met the Rockefellers and became friends with them. I think David was the one he knew. David died recently. But this would have all been back in the 70s. I don't know why. And then he reached a point where he just couldn't take it anymore, and he made a documentary. He died shortly after that. I think they killed him, right? If you figure it out yourself, you can say it. If somebody tells you and you repeat it, they'll kill you. And they usually tell you, don't ever repeat this. And they mean it. And by the way, if you don't understand, that's a contract. And this whole world revolves around contract. It's the ultimate fetish in the satanic world, the contract. Okay? And so if you want to know who the most satanic people in the world are, it's not necessarily the people out in the woods trying to summon a demon. Those could be just confused millennials. In fact, I could see a lot of people trying something like that just to see if it's real. Right? It doesn't, No, the real hardcore Satanists are the people who have the fetish for law. Law is the root of the satanic canon. Any scripture that claims to be the law of God is really purely satanic. Because God has no law. This is a free will space. There's consequence. There is law. But not only does God permit you to break the law, it's God's preferred method of you learning the law, experientially. Which is why we're down here so long. So, where do souls come from? You ever think about that? Right? So a soul is an eternal being that has no beginning or end. So a soul is a drop of water in the ocean of consciousness. Consciousness itself can be aware or unaware. Okay? So the growth of awareness is the expansion of your consciousness geography. Consciousness being assimilated is the acquiring of awareness. So for a soul to be formed as an individual being, there's a whole program it goes through. Okay? When pure consciousness comes in to 3D life, it begins in the mineral form. And that's why there's so much mineral fetish in spiritualism. Whether gold, silver, crystals, emeralds. And they do have properties. Probably most fully realized in Atlantis. Crystal-based technology. So, by the way, Superman is a thinly veiled Atlantean story. Krypton is Atlantis. It was actually here on this planet. Okay? And their technology in the comic book was based on crystals. And that was the basis of the technology in Atlantis, was crystals. And it's a whole other line of technology. Our line of technology is, a lot of crystals now. But because you can add silicon into the crystal family as well. And we've created a rather astounding silicon reality around us. Then it goes through all the classes of life in the chain of being. Mineral, vegetation, in all forms of life. All forms of life. Okay? And then you get up to the highest form of life on this dimension of existence, which is the human life. And then within the human lives, just within the human lives, you've got millions of years of difference in soul experience, of being a human being. Okay? Most of you who listen to me have probably been human for several million years already. Or you wouldn't be listening to the Talamanca Review. And you can see, I think in the Another Weeping Woman podcast, I talked about how easy it is for people to kill over here. It's particularly in this region of Costa Rica I live in. And I gave you the murder stats, which make the worst parts of Chicago look like Disneyland, minus the pedophilia. And it's just because it's a grouping of lower order souls. And they're going through the lessons of life and death. And that's the proper way to look at it, not to judge them. And if you tune into these things, you're never really in danger. Because for you to be in danger, you would have to be a threat or a challenge to them in some way. And if you're living at an elevated consciousness, you're neither a threat nor a challenge. You're not going to compete with them for money, women, or pride. And you're not going to have any problems. You may get jacked for a cell phone and whatever money you have in your pocket. So the process of pure consciousness coming into life and going through the refinement processes through the myriad incarnations on this planet are what create the individuated soul. And the individuated soul in its fully realized state is a fully aware particulate of God, meaning that the drop becomes the ocean. It's no longer a drop separated from the ocean. It's a drop, the consciousness of which can re-engage the ocean. By the way, the incarnational field doesn't end in matter. Incarnations continue outside the body. So you can start then to go into other life forms. You can start to become, at certain levels, you can start to become spiritual fixtures in the universe. A god is an incarnation. It's not an eternal thing. All these gods the Hindus worship, this creature the Jews worship, Hashem, Yahweh, whatever you want to call it, very temporary entity. It seems like a long time from the perspective of a human life, but in the cosmic clock, it's some dude waiting at, Yahweh's some dude, cosmically, he's some dude waiting at a bus station. That's it. That's his relevance. Okay? And we go into these incarnations. You can get a demonic incarnation. That would be kind of punishment. You can get an angelic incarnation. You can get an incarnation as a god. Okay? It's like, almost like a giant corporation. Okay? Now, when you look at the West, and you try to compare it to other parts of the world culturally, and this is a hobby of mine because of where I live and because it's so different from where I come. Oh, same TV, same Netflix, same Mac computers. You know, rice is rice, whether I'm eating it in Central America or North America. But the cultural imprint here is completely different. They're still living the way, they still have the values we had 150 years ago. Okay? It's very interesting the way things work over here. I sometimes hesitate because I know I'm speaking to a largely North American and European audience, and I don't want to sound like a caveman. And I don't want to offend anybody. But maybe sometimes I should just speak, and if offense happens, it happens. I'm a little gun shy after the reaction to, part of the book. And what I notice is that when women react to these things, like the line, my mother wanted to marry Tyler Moore her life, do they actually think about what I'm saying? Do they actually think about what I'm saying? Or do they just react out of some embedded, entrenched, programmed response that they think they have to do? Nobody's going to set me. I mean, you watch these Margaret Atwood interviews. I watched probably a half dozen of them, anywhere from 15 to 30 minutes. This happens to me a lot. Somebody will pop up in my YouTube feed, and then the way the algorithm works, if you watch one, it'll give you more. So I go through these phases on YouTube, and I went through this Margaret Atwood phase. And what I noticed about her, as a template for all people who've bought into this modern nonsense, and it's what it is. It's just pure nonsense. Everything about the 20th century, post-World War II, is just utter nonsense. Okay? I'm absolutely sure that women were happier 150 years ago than they are now. I don't think, I'm going to just say, look, one of the things, because Costa Rica, by the way, is a matriarchy. It's not a patriarchy. And I've never been happier. So I live in a matriarchy. Women run this country. The elected officials are men. The narco traffickers are men. But believe me when I tell you, women run this country. And they do it from their homes. And they do it from their pueblos. They don't do it by going to San Jose and getting into federal politics. And they're the most powerful force in the country. Okay? Even with all the murder over here and everything, now, women do get killed. But very, very rarely. And they do not like it over here. Okay? I'll tell you one famous story that happened in the last 2 years. This was like the talk of Costa Rica. For those who know. And not everybody knows. It depends where you live in Costa Rica, whether you're married into a Costa Rican family. And there was this big-time narco trafficker here. And they all have drop-dead gorgeous girlfriends. Like, you should, and the guys, they all look like Bobby from King of the Hill. Pudgy, and I don't know, there's like a genome for the narco trafficker in Costa Rica. They're always like kind of pudgy. They're not really fat, but they have this layer of fat all over their, I noticed it. I'm going, Jesus, it seems like a genetic type. And my nephew Joseph had the same build, and nobody else in the body has that build. But anyways, so this guy got pinched, and his girlfriend was on the outside, and he trusted her, and I think he probably loved her. And he left her in charge of all her money, and she was supposed to pay the legal bills and liaise with the lawyers and everything. And she took his money and went off with another guy and left him to, face a possible life sentence in prison. So he had her killed. And that was just down in close to me, like 15 kilometers away. So, I mean, it happens. But you got to be in the game. But it's not the Wild West. It's not Gaza, where they're literally sport hunting women and children. Okay? So in most parts of the world, men will not kill women. There's exceptions. Like that thing in Rwanda that produced a famous book by a Canadian general, General Romeo Dallaire, called Shake Hands with the Devil. He was in Rwanda when the massacre happened, and they had stand-down orders from the United Nations. They could have stopped it. I mean, the Houthis just had, machetes and stuff. They weren't armed. And they had stand-down orders from the United Nations, and the Canadian peacekeepers in Rwanda had to sit and for 10 days watch people hacked alive and not do a thing about it. Right? It's a different soul level. We shouldn't be mixing all these people. Okay? This is going to come back to haunt us. There's no way we should be mixing people from uneducated, areas of Africa with no infrastructure, assimilating them into Italy and France and Britain, Portugal, Spain. It's just the stupidest thing ever. Stupidest thing ever. Okay? And no country with any intelligence is doing it. Why isn't China taking in millions of international refugees to populate those ghost cities? They have the space. Everybody else taking people in has no space. They have a housing crisis. We have a housing crisis in Canada because just in the 9 years Trudeau's been in, he's brought in 10 million people. We've gone from a country of 31 million to 41 million in 9 years. And we have a housing crisis. Anybody surprised? No. Okay? How do I say this without sounding, again, like a caveman? Okay, maybe this is the way to do it. Tie it all up. There's things men can perceive that women can't, and there's things that women can perceive that men can't. These are generalities, not absolutes. You can definitely find men who can perceive everything a woman can perceive, and you can find women who can perceive everything a man can perceive. But generally speaking, for the vast majority of people, men have certain blind spots based on gender, and women have certain blind spots based on gender. Okay? Women can become mired in sentiment and not be able to accept a reality. And men can shut down their feelings because the complexity of them is too much to deal with. Okay? What I'm referring to are those situations in life where the life raft is full, the boat is sinking, and people are going to die. How do you make those decisions? If all the people who are going to allow themselves to fall into the icy waters beside the Titanic and allow their bodies to become food for fish and to die alone in the dark in the middle of nowhere, if they volunteer to do that, that is the most noble thing that could happen. But if nobody volunteers, how do you decide how to allot those seats on the ship? Okay? Now, the female approach might be, well, we can fit everybody in, hoping for a miracle. And the male approach would be, no, we can't. We can't. Now, generally, historically speaking, men will give up their lives for women. Men will sacrifice themselves to defend their family. And a man will, generally speaking, I'm not sure if it's still true, but generally speaking, a man would give up his life for a woman, especially if that woman had children and had responsibilities and had to raise 2 or 3 children. So if I was in a hostage situation and the terrorists said, okay, well, we're going to make an example out of someone, they're not meeting our demands, we got to kill somebody, and I was in a plane with 150 people, and I looked around and I went, okay, well, I'm 58, my son's fully raised, I've had a great life. I look around, there's a mother with a child, there's a young father. I'm going to go, I'm the perfect candidate. I'll go. And I would volunteer. I know you think I'm joking, but I would. Like in the blink of an eye. And do you know why? Because I wouldn't be able to live with somebody doing it for me. I would not be able to live with that sense of debt. Okay? Now, for millennia and for centuries, women have lived off that grace from men and never really acknowledged it. And believe me when I tell you, if I'm right about what's going on in the West now, the Mary Tyler Moores of this generation are going to find out pretty quick why men were needed. Because when 1 out of every 3 or 4 women in a city are being raped, and it's all being done by certain ethnic communities, and the police can't get any leads, your only protection is going to be a man. And men. Okay? Because we live in a world in which the most dangerous thing we're ever going to encounter, and that includes everything we're seeing in the skies now and all this nonsense, which I'll talk about in another podcast, but briefly to allude to that upcoming podcast, what exactly is new about what's going on in the world? Allow me to tell you, absolutely nothing. Just the language has changed. This has been the art of the 20th century, right? How is Elon Musk saying we live in a simulation any different than the Hindu mystics and Buddha saying the physical reality we exist in is an illusion? We've known this since the inception of the human race. Okay? But everything will rebalance because that's what we do. We rebalance. Remember what I said 30 minutes ago in this podcast. The method of learning that God prefers is to make the mistake, because that's the learning that imprints on you. You don't know anything if you don't know it experientially. You could listen to Brett Weinstein explain in almost perfect math and English what spooky action at a distance is. And if you were to say to him, Brett, have you ever projected your consciousness 100 kilometers away and read a note on somebody's nightstand, called them up, and said, this is what your note says, and you were right? Well, he's going to look at you like you're crazy. But he's the one who's crazy, because he's pretending to know something he doesn't know. He's seeing shadows on the wall and thinking he's actually seen the form, with its color, the glow in its face, everything. He hasn't. The only path out is within. The only escape from the almost non-stop fear and confusion that's coming is within. I've been telling you for a year now on the Talamanca Review. I've been telling you for 5 years in my books. I've been telling you for 5 years on the various radio shows I've done here and there. It's the only way. You have to take up an internal life, because the external world is emanating from what's inside of you. So to understand the external world, the true science to understand it is meditation. If you want to deconstruct and exploit it like you're not a part of it and you have no respect for the creation or the creator, then by all means, go the physics and calculus route. Create AI. But realize that that's not just a mistake you're making in your own backyard. You will be held to account for what that does to the whole human race. What's another thing that's going on now is epic levels of karmic consequence. If you ever were going to lead a life in which you did less, now would be the time. Just because it's epic levels of consequence now. Okay? Epic levels. I feel like I could go another hour tonight. I don't know what it is. That should be enough. All right, I'm Bruce McDonald, and this has been the Talamanca Review, and hopefully this will be regular every day now for my usual 50, 55 minutes, 1 hour. Peace out, folks. Nice to see you again.